How y'all doing? So the beauty of tonight is that on most Wednesday nights in the spring, Professor Douthit and I are in our Duke classroom doing our class, The History of Hip Hop, which we've now done for 10 years. This will be the last time we will be doing this class in person for a few weeks, since at Duke at least we're closing down shop for in-person conversations. So, it's great to be able to do this one more time for a little bit to an audience here in Tulsa, first time here. And given the opportunity, and I got to thank Dr. Johnson, whose career I've been following for a few years, for the invitation to come out and speak with y'all and to exchange ideas with all of y'all and of course, Ninth Wonder. So my memories of Chuck go back to my own undergraduate years as a 20-year-old at a small liberal arts college up in Western New York. And the way things functioned for us back in those days, if you weren't in New York or LA or Chicago, you weren't going to hear hip hop on the radio. And if you heard any hip hop on the radio, it might have been Houdini, it might have been Heavy D and the Boys, kind of like R&B friendly hip hop, but you certainly weren't hearing Public Enemy. And so where we were going to college in Western New York, there was no chance in hell we were ever going to hear Public Enemy. So whenever we went back to New York, I'm born and raised in the Boogie Down Bronx. Whenever we would go back to New York, we would get out TDK cassette tapes. And when Marley Marl was doing his show on BLS or if Red Alert was doing his show on KISS, we'd pop in our cassette tapes and record their shows, and that's how we had hip hop back in college, right? And they kind of counted on the New York City cats, to be able to bring back some music, from these shows. And so my best friend of like almost 40 years now, he had recorded Public Enemy's 98 Oldsmobile. And he would play that joint every morning as we were getting up and taking showers and getting ready to go to classes. And I remember the thing that stuck out to me was, one, who's this dude with this voice, right? Because, you could hear any Chuck D song anytime, and as soon as he opens his mouth, it's Chuck. And ain't nobody ever been able to replicate that. And then I was trying to figure out what is going on with this sound, right? Because, it wasn't just the drum machines that we were hearing. This is really the first generation of sample-based hip-hop. So the sound was just different. And so that was kind of like my introduction to Public Enemy. I graduated in the spring of 1987, and of course in the summer of 1987, they dropped Rebel Without a Pause. And if you know about that Fred Wesley sample, that kind of whistle sound that goes through the whole song that like bores into your brain so that you can't forget it. And then you listening to him talking about, Jesse Jackson and being a supporter of Jessamard, and it's like, wow, this is some other kind of stuff that we had been waiting for. And so from that moment on, I was a big-time Public Enemy fan and can remember going to Tower Records in June of 1988 and buying It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Bought that joint on vinyl, had it on cassette, got it on CD, downloaded on a couple of streaming platforms at this point in time. It was, for my generation, and to put this in a kind of historical context, I was of the generation, the first to grow up in the post-civil rights era. When they created things like Head Start, when they created Sesame Street, it was specifically intended for my generation. We were 3, 4, 5-year-olds at the time. We were the kids who went to graduations in the early 1970s, and we had to sing Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black at our kindergarten ceremonies and our Head Start ceremonies. And so by the time we got to college, and we were fortunate because, folks like Amiri Baraka were still on the road. Folks like Hakeem Abudi was still on the road. Sonia Sanchez was still on the road. They were younger and vibrant. So we got to figure out what the Black arts movement was and what the Black power movement was up front. I still remember the first time I saw Stokely Carmichael. And when we heard Public Enemy, and KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions, and Eric B. and Rakim, and X-Clan, and Poor Righteous Teachers, and I could go on and on with this, right? We finally had a musical soundtrack that fit the politics that had been passed on to us from this previous generations of poets and activists and writers and revolutionaries. And, you know, no one ever questioned the fact that Chuck D was the most prominent voice. And of course, that summer '89, when it looked like things were going to fall apart, because this was also a time where Public Enemy was publicly embracing the emergence of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. And, you know, and that's a long, complicated story in and of itself. But for my generation, what we knew of Louis Farrakhan is that when Jesse Jackson's campaign was under assault in 1984 when he was running for president, it was Farrakhan and Nation of Islam that really came out front. And Farrakhan, for the first time, acknowledged and instructed members of the Nation of Islam to go out and vote, which is something they had never done in the history of the organization, because he felt with Jesse Jackson running for president, this was the opportunity, right, for them to make their electoral power known. And so we had great respect for Louis Farrakhan in that period of time, even if the mainstream public didn't. We also appreciated the fact that Farrakhan was always willing that when there were beefs in hip hop, and folks forget about these kind of moments, like folks, you know, when Cube and Common were having their beefs 25 years ago, it was often Farrakhan who was the mediator of some of these beefs, so that it never got to the kind of violence that we eventually saw with Tupac and Biggie and a few folks after that. So it was important for us that someone like Chuck D and Public Enemy shouted out Farrakhan. But of course, it created controversy, right? Because, you know, you can't be a mainstream artist who supports someone that most of the mainstream views as anti-Semitic. And so there was this moment in, you know, the middle of 1989 where we thought Public Enemy was going to fall apart. You know, they had to fire Professor Griff, who had said some stuff that was, you know, really explicitly problematic. And the thing that saved them was that there was this movie by this cat who got his film degree from NYU, who graduated from Morehouse College. His parents called him Sheldon. His nickname was Spike. That movie, of course, was Do the Right Thing. And 1989 became the summer of Public Enemy, Spike Lee, Do the Right Thing, and Fight the Power. And listening to my man, Ninth Wonder, talk earlier, and we show this video every semester in class, watching that Fight the Power video, which is set up like a political rally, right, in Brooklyn on a Saturday morning, sometime in the spring of 1989, what we felt with Public Enemy was our political calling card. And I always remember Chuck said something around that time that, you know, we're rappers, we do music is important to us, but what's most important to us is that we want to produce 5,000 black leaders by the end of the decade. This is him speaking in 1990. And I remember as a 25-year-old who hadn't quite decided what I was going to do with my life, I wanted to be one of those 5,000 leaders. And I'd like to think that, you know, 30 years after he said that, when I look at Mr. Douthit and myself, we are part of those 5,000 leaders that Public Enemy helped to produce over the years. You know, we're celebrating Fear of a Black Planet, which from a sonic standpoint, you know, is almost like, it's so nostalgic because the albums that Public Enemy did with Fear of a Black Planet and It Takes a Nation of Millions, you can't make those albums anymore. And what I mean by that, you have the tools to do it, but it would be cost prohibitive to make those albums. You financially cannot make those albums because it would cost you too much to clear the samples that it wouldn't even make sense to do it. You can't even really do it as a mixtape in the particular environment that we're at now. So they were at a moment where they could be really forward-thinking in how we use the archive of black musical culture and a range of other musical cultures at a time when the corporations weren't really necessarily paying attention to it and the lawyers weren't necessarily paying attention to it. So that when you listen to Fear of a Black Planet right now, it really is like a time capsule, right, from this particular moment where hip-hop could be made a certain kind of way. But then you think about these songs, right? You know, the fact that they're sampling, you know, music, a range of, you know, R&B and funk music, stuff that kids weren't necessarily listening to. You know, this was still the moment where contemporary hip hop in the late 80s, early 90s was still very much invested in funk and soul music. So they literally are presenting to us at a time when you don't have Google and you don't have iTunes and you can't just go online and find a beat. They were providing us with an archive, right, to black musical culture. That archive that Pete Rock, right, and Ali Shaheed Muhammad and Q-Tip and Ninth Wonder, right, and we could go on, an archive that they were able to then build upon to create another historical moment in sound for hip hop, right? But it's an album that's also sampling Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, right, and the Cress color theory, right? So they actually bring in sociological and psychological theory into it. So, you know, these weren't necessarily albums that you were supposed to listen to. These were things that you were supposed to read in books. And it's been a long time since we had a hip hop, right? And that's not to say that dudes aren't doing important and conscious work now. But now, you know, this is a period of time when to listen to hip hop, you actually have to go buy 15 books too. Right, because they recognize, right, and I think more than anything, you know, when you see the legacy of Public Enemy, their first 4 albums go gold. And then for most part, as commercial artists, they disappear. As if they knew, Chuck and the rest of the crew knew that they had a short period of time. And they had to pack as much shit as possible into those first 4 albums, right, in order for that stuff to be out in the world, to be able to survive and being able to impact other people. The thing that I love about Chuck today is that he is as accessible as he was 30 years ago. Maybe not as accessible as Talib Kweli, but that's a whole nother conversation. But you could go online at any time and reach out to Chuck on Twitter, and Chuck will respond to you. He's making music that's now more accessible, right? He was at the early stages, right? The ground floor, the cutting edge of artists who were trying to figure out how to get their music out to the public without having to deal with radio and record companies, right? So when you think about what they did with Rap Station, right, to be able to create a platform for people to get access to Public Enemy music and other folks, you know, folks forget, you know, we like to clown Flavor Flav from time to time. You know, but both Chuck and Flavor Flav graduated from Adelphi University back in 1982. Flavor Flav plays 13 instruments, right? And you know, this is the thing, when you look like Flavor Flav and you play 13 instruments, how seriously is the culture going to take you, right? So you end up fitting into a role in which folks see you as, you know, being visible to them, right? And, you know, Chuck, you know, he was a graphic artist. That was what he was trained to do in college. That was his day job until Public Enemy became something special in the late 1980s. He was still working his day job as a graphic artist. But all the designs that you see of black men in the scope, right, are all things that he designed with the idea that we needed to make music, we needed to get people to think, but we also had to create a visual culture that spoke to that. And so I thank him for being so visible now. He's been very gracious with me. The first time I met him, he was hosting a week-long radio program on WBAI, a public radio station in New York, and he was scheduled to interview Mike Eric Dyson, and Dyson couldn't do it. Dyson said, Chuck, you should get this young cat, you know, Mark Anthony Neal, teaching up at SUNY Albany, to do that interview. And I remember taking the train down, and we only talked for about 15 minutes, but I also met Ravi Coltrane, John Coltrane's son, who was also being interviewed by Chuck. And over the last 20 years, when I've gotten to see Chuck and be able to connect with him, he's always been gracious with his time and his energy, and still so incredibly accessible.
Appreciate that, Dr. Neal. All right, so at this time, I'm going to bring up to the stage Ninth Wonder, producer, DJ, college lecturer, activist, all the above. Was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He gained recognition and critical acclaim, producing songs for a wide range of artists, including Jay-Z, Destiny's Child, Mary J. Blige, Erykah Badu, Ludacris, Common, Drake, and David Banner. 2014, Ninth Wonder was chosen to be on the executive board for hip-hop at the National Museum for African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian Institute, and currently serves as the NAACP's National Ambassador for Hip-Hop Relations and Popular Culture. A well-known hip-hop educator, he's currently on the faculty at both North Carolina Central University and Duke University. Ladies and gentlemen, Ninth Wonder.
How's everybody? I need to get with you, give you an updated bio, brother. Okay, let's work on that. Okay. My introduction to Chuck D starts in a middle school social studies classroom. I was in the 7th grade in Hill Middle School in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And one of my friends who, a lot of times, I don't know about y'all, but, I'm still cool with a lot of my high school friends and childhood friends. One in particular, his name is Randy Kilgore. We've been friends since we've been 11 years old. I talk to him today. I'm the friend out of my group of friends that they always check up on. Did you land yet? Did you make it where you were? So that's Randy. But Randy was in my social studies class in the 7th grade. I don't know how the school systems were here, but in Winston-Salem we had block class. So it's like, it was a class that lasted like 3 periods. And this was social studies, Mr. Overton, white man. And so we're in class and Randy was saying word to herd, word to herd, word to herd all the time. And I didn't know what that was. I know we were saying word up because of Cameo at the time, but I didn't know what to herd came from. I didn't know where that addition came from. So after class, I think we went to lunch, and I asked him, I said, man, why you keep saying that, man? Why you keep saying that? He said, man, I got it from Chuck D. I said, who is Chuck D? Who is Chuck D? He said, Chuck D is in a group called Public Enemy. And I was like, okay. And he was like, when we get back to the class, I give you my tape for the young people who have never listened to a tape before. Tape is a thing about this big, and it has 2 holes in it, and there's tape in it. And you had to rewind it to play it from the beginning, the names on the front and this side and that side was an A side and B side. And sometimes the tape was the original tape of Public Enemy. Sometimes, in a lot of cases, it was your mom's gospel tape that you dubbed over and made your own tape. But he had the actual cassette tape of Public Enemy's second release, 1988 release, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And he said, I'll let you hold it, which is, again, kind of shows the relationship that we had with music at the time, because like I talk to our students all the time about, you don't own your music, it's on a cloud. So the relationship you have with your music, if you lose your phone, you're more worried about your pictures than your music. For us, if somebody broke in your car and stole your CD booklet in '94, that's a whole different feel. So when somebody asks you to borrow something, it meant something. So he's like, man, I'll let you borrow it. I said, okay, cool. So I took it home. And so this is 1988. And to put you in the mind frame of that time, hip hop wasn't in a place where that type of message resided. This is the year prior we had Eric B. and Rakim, we had Biz Markie, we had Beastie Boys, Houdini. We were still trying to figure it out, right? As far as sound, as far as message. Because a lot of people get the misconception of when we say real hip hop, that hip hop was laden with messaging and conscious messages since its inception, and that's a lie. It was that's exactly what it was. It was party like Joe Ski Love. If your name had ski in it, that meant you dealt with a white substance that was powdery, right? And so Curtis Blow came from that. So it was party and bullshit. That's all it was. And until we got to the mid '80s, it kind of turned the corner when we had not only the inception of consciousness, but the inception of religion when it came to Rakim and Big Daddy Kane with Assalamu Alaikum and the 5% Nation and stuff like that. So that was kind of the tip of the iceberg, but Chuck D just knocked the door down. So I said all that to say because, Biz Marquis's Going Off was one of the first albums I ever bought. And the titles on that album was Pickin' Boogers, Albee Square Mall, This Is Something for the Radio, Nobody Beats the Biz, Making Music with the Mouth Biz. Like, this is the titles off of this album. Pretty much a lot of titles are like that off of albums, right? Beastie Boys is No Sleep Till Brooklyn, Brass Monkey, Paul Revere. Like, not too much deep meanings to the songs or the titles. But the name of this Public Enemy album was It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, right? The first song on that album is called Countdown to Armageddon. Like, I don't know what effect you would think that'll have on a 7th grader, right? Because I always ask my students when I teach class and we've been teaching hip hop together for 10 years. I'll always ask my students to get a gauge of where people are in their musical life. Ask somebody, what was the first album you bought in middle school? Or what was the first album you consumed in middle school? That would tell you everything about that person. And so in my classes, I get, what we're in 2020 now, so that would be, everything from Drake to Young Thug or whatever the contemporary was when this kid was in the 7th grade. When somebody asks me, I'm like, Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos. Like, that's my consumption of music in the 7th grade. At the same time, I'm still trying to figure myself out because adolescence is huge, trying to figure out who you are in the 7th grade. So the titles on this album was Countdown to Armageddon, Rebel Without a Pause, Terminator X and the Edge of Panic, Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos, She Watches Channel Zero, Night of the Living Bassheads, Cold Lamping with Flavor, Show 'em What You Got. Like, listen to these titles, and you're feeding this and pumping this to a 7th grader like me. Not only me, my friend Randad had the tape for months, so he's already been infected. So then now it's me, and then now we're talking about, all of us listening to these messages. Right before that, we only knew about probably 6 famous black people, right? Rosa Parks, Booker T, Frederick Douglass, MLK, Harriet Tubman. You were lucky if you heard about a Sojourner Truth. You were lucky if you heard about Phyllis Wheatley. You were really lucky if you heard about Malcolm X. This is mid-'80s. You got to think, I was in the 7th grade in 1988. And 1986 is when they first passed the Martin Luther King Day, right? Everybody think we had this holiday forever. We did not. So it was all new to me. So now I'm listening to Chuck talk about Marcus Garvey and Lewis Latimer and Charles Drew and all of these people in music. And I'm like, in this music, I'm like, what? But he's not saying it like cool like Houdini. This boat don't start. The After Dark. Like that. No, he was yelling it at you. Like he was, I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and said it was suckers. They wanted me for the army, whatever. Picture me giving a damn. I said never. Here is a man. And I'm like, phew. Well, I'm not going to the army. So now, and then you have this person like Flav, who this generation looks at as a joke, to us, he wore a clock because he wanted to say, we always want you to know what time it is. And so that was another thing too. So I done consumed this album for a week. So, and my friend Randy has asked me to bring this tape back, and I ain't brought it back yet. So, so I get to class, and we're having a conversation about the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. We about to talk about Christopher Columbus today in social studies. Just we're talking about all type of explorers, Christopher Columbus, Pizarro, Magellan, like we're going through the whole bit. So we get to Columbus, discovering America. Like I said, I'm infected. I'm public enemied out. And so I got a question. He said, what's your question? And I said, well, that's a lie. Straight up, that's a lie. What you're saying, it's not even a question. I made a statement. That's a lie. It's this. What do you mean? Well, Christopher Columbus ran into America and he came and infected all of these people and stole all the resources. And I'm just spitting this stuff off. And I'm 13. I got sent to the office that day for being, out of line. And my mom she's a retired school teacher now. They decided to call my mom because I'm in the office pleading my case about this album. And so she comes and she said, well, son, where did you hear it from? And I said, Chuck D, mama. Like, Chuck D told me that Columbus that the whole thing is a lie. He also told me, so we talking about that, and now we're breaking out the songs. What does Night of the Living Bassheads mean, and what does this song mean, and what is this about? And I play Rebel Without a Pause, and at the beginning of that is brothers and sisters. I don't know what this world is coming to. Like, to play that in front of my mom and the assistant principal and the principal, who are both white men, was scary to them, right? But that's my first encounter with Public Enemy. And this came at a time where Cosby Show was on TV for 4 years now. We had school days. We haven't even got to Do the Right Thing yet. We have Different World that's been on TV for 2 years. We have Queen Latifah coming with All Hail the Queen. And we're coming with all this new level of black Afrocentricity. Like, we were Black Lives Matter before Black Lives Matter at that particular time. And so what do you do when that type of Self-Destruction was the song at the time. So what do you do when that type of message is being poured into a middle school of black kids? And also poured into a middle school of white kids, because this is at the time where we forget that hip hop is probably the most all-encompassing genre of race that we have. That's why we ended up with groups like Public Enemy. That's why we ended up with like Christian Laettner on a Duke campus wearing a Malcolm X hat, and everybody like, what? Because he came from that generation. So I'm just, at that time, then the next album was Fear of a Black Planet. With Fight the Power was the theme song for Do the Right Thing. And the scene in Do the Right Thing resembles so much, it was like a foreshadow of what happened to Eric Garner, right? And so by the time I turned 15 in 1990, I'm super black. Like, so Chuck D was the genesis of what hip hop can do with this voice from a conscious sense and from a revolutionary sense. If All Right by Kendrick Lamar was a black man living in America, then Chuck D would be The Shores of Ghana. That is the lineage that we have. It goes back that far. And I'm skipping artists. I'm skipping I'm saying Kendrick, then Kendrick and Nip, then it goes to, you know, Mos and Kweli and Common and The Roots and everybody that had that heavy message in their song. It starts with Chuck. Like it starts with Chuck D. He is the one that, you know, basically I didn't have pictures of Black Panthers in my house. There was a picture of Martin Luther King on a funeral calendar in my house, or a church fan, but there was no pictures of Huey P. Newton in my house. I grew up in the American Black South. It was Jesus in my house. Chuck D was the first image I had ever seen of anything what a Black Panther looked like from the S1Ws. I hadn't seen what that looked like. So Chuck D became the genesis of that for me and as a 7th grader, pretty much. So I guess we're supposed to talk. So I guess the big question is now that we talk about a lot, and every time we try to talk to our students, we try not to alienate them because we're dealing with a new generation of hip hop. And I think sometimes we make the mistake of automatically condemning what the next generation is listening to. And you will never get the attention of that next generation if you automatically do that. But what we have done is we try to put their brains to work. We try to say, okay, you have the Black Lives Matter hashtag, where's the soundtrack for it? You need a soundtrack to go along with this beautiful hashtag this generation has created. You need a soundtrack to go along with the Black president that we had. Where is the hip hop soundtrack for this hashtag or this movement that you have? Because every revolutionary movement in American history in the 1900s had a soundtrack to go with it. So I think that's one of the things we talk about a lot, and a lot of times our students come up empty.
Yeah. I mean, that goes back to your earlier point, right? They think about music differently. You know, music is not something that's integrated into their lives and culture. Music is a product. And so you don't necessarily think about revolutionary products that, well, they do. It becomes another thing like a T-shirt or hashtag that, you know, they could put on to articulate their politics, but it's not actually part of the culture of the politics that they express. And, you know, we think about folks like Woody Guthrie or Sam Cooke as two examples. You know, obviously, all these examples of folks who came through soul and folk music in the 1960s who made music but were movement people at the same time. You know, Nina Simone was a movement person, right? So her music reflected that. Sam Cooke in his close relationship with Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and Jim Brown was a movement person. His music didn't always reflect that, but his business practices did. Right? And now we have young folks who don't necessarily see those connections because, you know, this is the thing. When you think about Sam Cooke didn't make a whole lot of money, right? He wasn't making, he was on the same level of the same label as Elvis. He wasn't making Elvis money. Right. And so now we're at a moment where artists can make so much more money. What they create is so much more lucrative. It becomes so much more of a challenge for them to express anything political, right? That's going to take away the bag, and that's real talk. And we have to be honest about this conversation because we also know that people got to take care of folks. People got folks on payrolls. You know, we know there's no transference of intergenerational wealth in Black communities. Right, so if you 40 years old and Black and successful, you likely in some way are taking care of your parents, right? You know, because of the lack of that generational wealth. So we don't begrudge anybody for getting the bag, for securing the bag. But it also means that the politics looks a little different, right? And we have to always remind our students that the music that we claim around this politics, artists actually had to take risk in order to do that music.
that's probably the biggest fault line that artists fall into, which particular path to take. Do I take the path of having such a message that may be too heavy for the generation, or do I secure the bag another way? It's probably one of the biggest conundrums people can get themselves into by getting into this business. Because at the end of the day, this is a business. Just as, you know, talking about the street, talking about dope, drugs, whatever is a market, consciousness is a market too. That is a market that sells, right? And at one point we had a look for what consciousness was. Like, for a long time, you know, before he got his, you know, we joke about it all the time, but before he got his quote unquote makeover, like Common was a depiction of what consciousness was, especially in the early 2000s when him and Erica was together. So this is true. So, you know, and there were certain things that came with consciousness, right? Burning of incense, lava lamps, right? They call them tree huggers, backpack, all of this stuff, you know. And so that's what it was. So sometimes people struggle exactly which direction to take to come into this business when we talking about black consciousness. Like, but then also we also look at black consciousness through one scope. We don't look at, you know, 50 Cent made the comment, if you woke up in the morning and you're conscious, right? We don't look at what Future talks about in his music or what Thug talks about in his music as black consciousness. There may be a sect of blackness that you either don't jive with or don't understand.
21 Savage.
Right. Or feel like that is negative, but that is hip-hoppers are responsible for telling their story. And if that's their story, they have a right to tell it, especially if it represents a group of people.
I mean, I think that's an important point to remember, that all wokeness don't look the same.
Right.
Because when we think about that moment that was Public Enemy's moment, you know, we think back now about how conscious native tongues were, but what made them who they were in that moment, it wasn't necessarily in their lyrics, right? They weren't talking black power in the way that Chuck D did, but it was a style of clothes, right? When we saw a Q-Tip and A Tribe Called Quest, when we saw De La, you know, when we saw Moni Love, when we saw the Jungle Brothers, right, and they had that whole Afro, you know, British cosmopolitan thing popping off, you know, with Karen Wheeler and those kind of folks in Soul to Soul, you know, it was a look that said black power without it necessarily being part of the lyrics of the music. I think we're at a moment now where everybody wants wokeness and black wokeness to look and act a certain kind of way. And it also means that we don't recognize artists who are actually doing important political work, like a Nipsey, right? Because we don't necessarily see it out front in the context of the music.
Because Tribe talked about girls more than they talked about anything else.
Oh, absolutely.
Like 100%. Bonita Applebum, Electric Relaxation,
Butter.
Hot Sex on the Planet, Butter, like. And everybody likes to stick to, they would.
Hot Sex on the Platter.
People, yeah, right. People like to use them as y'all ain't listening to nothing, Tribe, you know, they were talking about they were conscious. No, they don't do this. Like, they had, the look was conscious.
Right.
The colors were conscious. Especially the cover of Low End Theory was conscious with the red, black, and green. They only probably had one song named after somebody, Steve Biko, and people still don't even know
who Steve
Biko is.
Right.
But everything else was not about, it's more about life than anything. It wasn't about, you know, going back to Africa and whatever people like to stick on their Tribe Called Quest. And De La Soul wasn't that either. Like, De La Soul was even more risque with Tribe, especially with their second album, De La Soul Is Dead. So that's exactly right. I think people put consciousness in a particular box. So when Nipsey comes along, like you said, let's not forget, Nipsey had a duality to him that a lot of people didn't have in South Central Los Angeles. He was Eritrean from Eritrea, and he was a rolling 60s Crip. Like, let's talk about that for a second. Like, he was on both sides of the spectrum, right? But then really not if you think about it, if you know the history of the Crips was a neighborhood watch group first. So that was Tookie Williams and Mike Conception's, you know, that was their goal. And even if we look at that, does everybody know who Mike Conception's nephew is? Nobody? Anthony Fifth. You know who Anthony Fifth is? Top Dog. Top Dog of TDE, who gave us Kendrick, Schoolboy, SZA. That's Michael Conception's nephew, right? So we even ask ourselves what Mike Conception created, him and Tookie created in the Crips, if that wouldn't have happened to him to get that necessarily bag that we talked about, for him to give it to his nephew, for him to start it for seed money for TDE. Like, this is what we're talking about. So Nip kind of lived in that duality in a major way, right? Because he didn't look the part. He didn't come from an area that would come from at all that you would think. And not only did he not look the part, he also opened another door of consciousness, meaning economic empowerment. Like, we weren't talking about owning black business. I didn't hear Chuck D talk about a lot of owning black businesses. He was talking about taking over the government, but he wasn't talking about owning black businesses, right? But Nipsey was on like really economic wealth and making yourself empowered in a business sense. Like, that was something totally different. And he was feeding that to a lot of young black kids. And if we talk from an LA sense or California sense, a lot of Latino kids. So that's how kind of Nipsey morphed himself into another form of what consciousness can look like. These people got some questions, dog. I know it. I can feel it.
Before we get to questions, give him a round of applause first.
Go for it.
Thank you for coming. I'm a lawyer, so my question's gonna be long for no reason, and I apologize for that. I'm a Southern boy, you go Oklahoma, I'm a country boy, and I grew up listening to No Limit records. Like, my brothers and cousins, they listen to hard, right? And that's about naked capitalism, 28 albums in 1 year. This is about the money. And can you just speak to the clashing of capitalism and consciousness, and really, you guys have touched on it already, but really from the lens of utilizing that, in my opinion, to denigrate like Southern artists. Like what Jay-Z does now, Master B did in the 90s, and he was a country bumpkin, and now Jay-Z is agencies and all that stuff, is a black business-minded person. You know, Master B did that 20 years ago, and it just wasn't respected in the same way. So that's my question.
Okay. I'm just going to speak it from my perspective, okay? Being in college at this time, during the coming of No Limit, all right? First things first, at first I was angry at No Limit. This is, without a shadow of a doubt, because I just didn't like the sound of it.
It wasn't good.
Right? But the reason why, and even looking back on it, it really starts with Puff. This is where it starts, okay? It starts with Puff. And the reason why I say it starts with Puff is Puff was the first person, widespread, in hip-hop that made people sit at home and say, well, shit, I can do that.
Tell the Jersey story.
Huh?
Tell the Jersey story.
Jersey.
About us giving out too many damn jerseys.
Yes, right. This is what I'm getting to. When we sat at home, and if we look at hip-hop going back, starting from 95 going back, right? There was only two people that we looked at the TV, we looked at strange at some points. We looked at Vanilla Ice strange from day one, right? After Ice Ice Baby, we thought it was cool, but after that, he got a movie, he did another song. It was like, okay. Another person we started to look at strange, which is probably the first points of capitalism in hip hop, was MC Hammer. Hammer, although, this is gonna be a long answer, although Hammer changed the look of everybody in hip hop from 88 to 90. Because Heavy D was wearing jumpsuits before that. Hammer turned his mother out, then go back and look at the We Got Our Own Thing video. He got big pants, all that's Hammer. Hammer totally changed the game. Same thing with Bobby Brown. Every little step I take comes exactly straight from Hammer's turn his mother out, right? Let's get it started, pump it up. So Hammer's like the first, those are the first two. But still, even with that, there was a skill to what Hammer did, right? The way that Hammer danced all night long on stage, right? That was something. I grew up in a city that we had a person that dressed like Hammer every day. I'm pretty sure y'all did. He even garnered the name Hammer, right? So it still had a skill to it. When I sat at home and saw Nas for the first time, when I saw Biggie for the first time, Tupac, Snoop, Outkast, I said to myself, I can't do that. I can't do that. Like, Live from Bedford-Stuyvesant, the livest one. Represent beat. I can't write where I can say it, but I can't write it, right? So when Puff came along, he came with twofold. He came when he started to start from dancing and started rapping and started, Mace and all of that. Not only was it simple sounding to the point where it sounded easy to do, but from a producer standpoint, we were upset. It's like, well, dang, he just looping Hollywood swinging. Like, he's not even digging for any records. Like, that's not even what the culture is. So now, once we get the Master P, and one of his big hits is make him say, nah, now we really sitting at home like, although the beats was banging, that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is, somewhere along the lines, when you go to an NBA game, you can either sit up in the bleeds, you can sit close to the court, you can get courtside. You can get as far as down as you can. What can you not do, though? Get on the court. You cannot put on a jersey. You couldn't. I felt at that time, well, not with Southern hip hop, that wasn't the point, because we had Ghetto Boys, we had UGK, we had all of that. I felt at some point, with not only Southern hip hop, with some parts of hip hop around the country, we just started giving out too many fucking jerseys. Everybody can do this, as long as you got the bag you in. And at first it was great because it was capitalism and it was great and this whatever. But once it got to the point, we looking around like, man, it's too many, it's more rappers than fans. It's more people that rap than, like everybody in this room, whether they have a corporate job or whatever where they work, got 5 people at their job that got a SoundCloud page. I bet you anything. Because we've made it to the point that anybody can do this. And that has cheapened and watered down our culture. No matter what part of the country you're from. I don't agree with it being put on the South so much. I don't agree with that at all. Because some of the greatest rappers of all time has ever come from the South. And I don't like to stick that to the South because James Brown came from the South. So that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is we just gave too many jerseys out that anybody can be in this illustrious culture that we call hip hop because they got the bag. Answer your question? Kind of, sort of. I skipped the Jay-Z part because Jay-Z do things that we can't do. And we can't judge even his new stuff, but we're looking at the cryptic messages and reasonable doubt that we're still breaking down to this day. We can't, you need a Rosetta Stone to listen to that album, man. We can't, it's still 20 years later, it was like, oh, that's what he meant when he said that. Yeah, you can't do that. Yes, sir.
Jordan. Sorry, I'm soft spoken, so if I need to repeat it, just let me know. touch on your giving out too many jerseys stuff. Do you think, to expound on that, do you think it's something with the culture might need to break it down? Like, there's different forms of hip hop where you got trap music, you got genre bending stuff, kind of, I just want you to expound on that, maybe where your thoughts are on, because we do think hip hop, like, it's proven it's the #1 music entity in the world right now, so it's only gonna keep growing. Do you think, how do y'all think we should move forward with all of that?
So one of the things we started doing with our students, and to give you some sense of this class, usually about 120 students, the majority of the students in the class are not black, right? This is Duke, so it is what it is. We have to have a conversation with them in the very beginning of class to talk about what is your criteria for what is good, what is great, what's legendary, because they never think about that stuff, right? Because we kept getting responses before we went through this exercise. What we would get is that's a great song and it's important because it's hot, right? And then we have to talk about, well, why is it hot? Who invested in it to make sure that Laffy Taffy was a #1 pop record in the United States, right? But the point that we're making is that 20 years from now, 10 years from now, ain't nobody talking about Laffy Taffy, right? So what is the criteria to decide something that 20 years from now, like To Pimp a Butterfly, you're going to still go back to that and be like, oh, yeah. Because they just don't think about those kinds of things because their music is not introduced to them in that context. So that when you ask them questions like, well, who's hip-hop's Coltrane? Who's hip-hop's Ella Fitzgerald? Who's hip-hop's Miles Davis? Who's hip-hop's Sonny Rollins, right? All incredible icons, but all very, very different artists. Who's hip-hop's Billie Holiday? They can't answer those questions.
Give it up for this man. What y'all doing? As far as the different genres, I think it's evident that needs to happen now because hip-hop is a 47-year-old art form in the United States. Although I personally feel that hip-hop goes past that time because of the diaspora. But absolutely, like I think we're at that point in time. They did it with every other genre. You have, in the Grammys, you have R&B and traditional R&B, right? Loosely translated, R&B and R&B for old folk. That's what they really trying to say, right? For people who like singing and for people who like singing. Singing is traditional R&B. Singing is R&B. So I think hip-hop is definitely at that point. I don't think you can put Common, Nip, Pusha T, Jay Electronica, and Rhapsody in the same. I don't think you can put those 5 artists in the same category as, rest in peace, Juice WRLD. I don't think you can do that. That's different. That's a totally different sound. The problem is the powers that be look at hip hop in a vacuum. They think we all gravitate. It's all just one thing. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's all. I get it all the time. Like I get parents kind of forget. I'm 45 years old, bruh. Like, and so a lot of them come to me and say, well, "Can you help my son? I know you like to know the music." I don't. No, ma'am. I don't know the music your son is listening to. We are different. I have no idea. He's gonna play me some people. I know their names because I'm in the business. I don't play none of this. What my man say in Menace Society? They don't get no play in my ride. I don't have it in my car. So people don't even understand, who don't understand the culture, the different dynamics of it. To understand the culture within itself has been at a war for years. Like, it's been a war going on for years for what's right, what's wrong, who's real, who isn't real. Why isn't the special eds and the Big Daddy Kanes, why don't we treat them as they treat Arnold Palmer at the Masters? Like, what's the problem? You know what I mean? And so all of that needs to be figured out. the different genres, the different sounds, everything. It really needs to. So we have a better understanding of the culture.
And, you know, because one of the things the larger culture has done is that it's infantilized hip hop. So that when we hear hip hop, we immediately think it's something that's made for 18-year-olds, right? And not everybody fits into that box because ain't everybody 18 no more. The genius of Jay-Z's 444 is that he made an album for 50-year-old dudes who need to be in therapy. Right, and there's actually an audience for that that's very different than Juice WRLD's audience was.
Right.
So how you're talking now and speaking about why isn't, special eds and Big Daddies treated like Arnold Palmer? I read an interview with Guru, rest in peace, about 12 years ago. He was saying one of the things is that hip-hop is one of the genres that doesn't revere its elder statesmen.
Right.
And he said the reason why they had to stop hip-hop honors is young artists having no interest in being seen with older artists on television. Young artists having no interest in learning an old school rapper's rap for a tribute performance. Do you, with the students you guys have now, you talk about the differences in listening that you have. Do you believe that the youth should go back and revere its artists, check out the old hip hop? Is that a must? Is that essential?
I don't put as much weight on it as people would think for so many reasons. Because when I was 13, I didn't give a damn about Al Green. This is the truth. If my uncle walked in with Al Green's album with Let's Stay Together on it, and I was playing The Great Adventures of Slick Rick and children's stories, Once Upon a Time Not Long Ago, and Hey Young World, you better get out of my face with Al, bro. I don't want to hear no Al.
But what if you were 13 years old and you could sing?
If I could sing, maybe. But still, I still don't know, because I'm thinking 13 years old, I might, at that time, I'm thinking Guy. Groove Me. Right. But see, a lot of us didn't know that was Funkadelic.
Right.
Because a lot of us in the South, a lot of that music was the devil's music. Right? My house was filled with my parents. My house was filled with Mighty Clouds of Joy, bro, and Williams Brothers, and the Clark sisters, and no,
That's too contemporary.
I'm talking about Rough Side of the Mountain.
Soul
That.
Stirrers.
Like,
Clay
my
Evans.
house sounded like a funeral home. Like, you walk in, it was in my house. So I didn't hear a lot of that. Like, the only secular artist who played in my house was by my mother. She played Luther Vandross. It was Luther and then James Cleveland. It wasn't a whole lot of. So, but going back to your question, I think it's important, but we have to understand, like, where we are in time. House Party as a movie turned 30 years old a couple days ago. Yeah, now everybody like, man, oh, come on. We are about to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Friday. Next year, New Jack City will be 30 years old, right? So if I'm thinking of a 1988 sense, was I thinking about anything that happened in 1958? I wasn't. So I can't blame a kid who doesn't know. I can't. And we like to say, well, it's out there, they can find it. Where do you start, really? Like, this is the internet. This is the World Wide Web. Like, where do you start? If you've been consuming this sound since you've been in middle school, where do you start? We can say Biggie. That's the easy thing to say, right? But where do you start if I want to say, oh, you ain't listening to Mike Geronimo? You know what I mean? Like, we don't understand how many rappers we had in the 90s that could rap. So where do you start when it comes to if you're an 18, 17-year-old kid? And another thing is about us not appreciating old artists is We didn't do our due diligence. That's our fault. We didn't do our due diligence early on. We didn't take care of Kool Herc and Kaz and them.
Right.
Right? We didn't take care of them. So we have to make sure, and then America never really prepared for when hip hop was going to grow up anyway, like he was saying. Like,
So this is my thing now, because let's look at another form of black music and jazz. And I'm not the biggest fan of conservatories, because I think conservatories, you lose something of the essence of what some musics are and the cultures that produce them. But jazz is a form that's in conservatories now, and you cannot be a contemporary jazz artist. If you play saxophone, you cannot be a saxophonist and not know John Coltrane's My Favorite Things. Right? You cannot be a trumpeter and not know. I mean, just not know. Because when you go through these spaces, the first thing they're going to ask you will play something from Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. And so what would it look like to be able to create and sustain hip-hop conservatories that allow us to be able to acknowledge talented folks and take them through a process, right, where they're woodshedding on a regular basis, right, to figure out who the greats were and are and develop their own style. Because the culture, and I would even say black folks themselves, don't take hip-hop seriously in that way, we would never think to create that kind of structure. We even have that structure for gospel music. It's not called conservatories. It's called any black church in America on any Sunday morning. Right. If you're going to sing in that choir, you're going to have to, even if you don't like James Cleveland, you're going to have to know some James Cleveland. You're going to have to know some Winans. You're going to have to know some Twinkie Clark, right? Even if you don't know the Clark sisters.
Validate the newer artists. I don't know or how you end up invalidating some of the newer artists. Because I don't know where the quote came from, but someone once told me that it's people that are reporting what's going on in the hood. Like, this is not just something that's marketed because there's a demo for it, but like, this is really happening. You know, when X was doing his thing, XXXTentacion, Juice WRLD, Uzi now, like, it's not so much that they're just trying to live a lifestyle that sells. I mean, like, the opioid epidemic is like a huge thing. Like, everybody needs therapy now, and like, we're starting to see that, like, you know, because we don't have therapy and because we don't have resources, that's what people escape to. I feel like there's still a conversation around validating those artists, you know, maybe outside of putting them in a conservatory, but still, like, where do we start getting into, like, this is why this artist matters, even though on the surface are just gonna copyright.
And I would say that that's on you. I would say it's not my job to judge contemporary artists in that way. What I say to the younger generation who's invested in this music, this is your job, and it's your job to develop a criteria or sets of criteria to make sure that folks understand these are the artists that are important, these are the artists that are not so much. Like, one, you know, easy definition for me is it something that's easily reproducible? Right. So when we had when Ziggy Azalea was doing her Yiggy, right? Heard the Iggy, okay. Right. She ain't Iggy Pop. But when Iggy Azalea was doing her thing, right, and folks are all upset, oh, you know, she's stealing from the culture will appropriate. I'm like, I'm never worried when white people appropriated the lowest common denominator of black culture. When I start seeing white people appropriate Catherine Dunham, when I start seeing white folks, you know, appropriate Billie Holiday, right, that's when I get concerned, right? And part of that is just developing a criteria. What do you think is great that's being produced in this moment?
Without because a lot of times in this particular generation, you see hip hop before you hear it. Validation is huge from a number standpoint, from a view standpoint, from a blue check standpoint, from an all this standpoint. Before there's even a chance taken, there's so many parameters and so many things that have to even happen for some kids to even like an artist. Did they do Coachella? Are they on XXL's freshman class? Did they do Breakfast Club? Who are they dating? All of this stuff, right? that adds to their greatness. If you look at a pie graph for an artist, about that much is the musical component. The rest of it is what the artist is made of, right? So like he said, you have to figure out what is the criteria for a great rapper at this particular time. If you ask us what our criteria was, we're not only going to tell you what it is, we're going to give you a verse to prove it.
Right.
And we're going to say, all right, now find me somebody else that can do that.
Because how do we figure out how to talk about artists who aren't flashy, right? And it's my Tim Duncan hip hop argument, right? And I will always claim that Black Thought is the Tim Duncan of hip hop. Dude who comes with his lunch pail every day and puts in work and been doing this shit for 25 years and goes home, right? How do we develop a criteria that says he's great because of that, right? And not because, as Jay said, he's animated like a Busta Rhymes.
I got a question. I'm a musicologist archivist with the Dylan Center, also born in 1975. I remember in 1987, 12 years old, there was a documentary called It Was 20 Years Old, or 20 Years Ago Today. It was on the Beatles' 1967 Sgt. Pepper's coming out. And at about that time, there was a total commodification of white rock boomer music of that time period that has extended. And I've watched my own generation be sold back to myself, like the G.I. Joe movies, like, whatever, all that stuff. And it seems, and Dylan himself, it's the bootleg series, and you get all of these like reissues of all the deepest cuts and that sort of thing. Is there the same sort of commodification of nostalgia within, does it the same deal you get in
Griselda. Do you know who Griselda is? And make no mistake, they're dope. Let's not get this confused. What your question kind of ties to this gentleman's question back here. Hip hop runs in 20-year cycles. A lot of us just wait for it to come back, right? Whether it be in the form of Griselda, who for us, a lot of us is two things with Griselda. Griselda, we're happy to see it on television because they were on Fallon. You got to understand this. They were on Fallon talking about birds and coke. Like, this is, right? But at the same time, the way they look for us who can remember was Wu-Tang Clan. Like, West Side Gun is, the way he dresses is Ghostface Killer all over again. But for us, a lot of us our age, we're not only saying this is dope, we're also saying thank you, something I can like. And something I don't have to search for. So that's in the form of Griselda. Like, that's exactly what it is. So a lot of times, again, it runs in 20 years. Like, the whole idea of lo-fi beats. And all of us are looking around like, yeah, okay, it's SB 1200, but who's counting? You know what I mean? If that's what it's gonna be for you to lo-fi it up, as long as you're gonna chop up some drums and get a sample, hey man, whatever you wanna call it, we're just happy that it's back. Whatever you wanna call it, that's fine. So hip hop has a way of reinventing itself. Like now, even for fashion, like Champion is coming back. Like my nephew asked me for a Champion sweatshirt, and it was $70, and I'm thinking just a couple years ago, it was in Walmart for $12. Like, Champion is it. They like, I need a Champion. Uncle Knife, I need a Champion. I gotta have Champion. I'm thinking, okay, Champion, okay, cool, Champion. Now it's $70 for a sweat. I was like, wow. Like, so a lot of these things are repeating itself from the Champion. We had a snapback phase for a while, and I had to show my students the DOC's album cover from '89. They like, oh, this ain't new. And, all of the kids who wear there are a lot of basketball players that have this big like natural plot of hair on the top of their head and the shade on the side. Like, nah, Professor Ninth, man, you just old. And I show them an old picture of Busta Rhymes. They're like, oh, it ain't new. I show them leaders of the new school, like, oh, so this ain't. So hip hop does that a lot.
Yeah, that was my question is that, you know, we keep getting sold new releases of Beatles records and new releases of Miles Davis and new releases.
We're gonna keep getting told that.
Yeah, but are there new releases of, you know, like the 6 LP box set of It Takes a Nation of Millions?
Oh yeah. They just dropped the
collection.
The collection. They just put out there's a Jizza Liquid Swords collection out right now, because the Liquid Swords turns 25 years old, right? Crazy. So a lot of that is a lot of us are buying box sets. Black Moon put out a box set. They're gonna put out one like in about 3 years. We're gonna wait on Black Star's box set. Like, you know what I mean? We're waiting for these anniversaries to come around, because that's we have now landed in the place of where our parents felt about Earth, Wind, and Fire. Like we've now landed in that place. We want the anthology collection. Yeah. Who? You and then you. Okay. We do this in class. We be pointing all over the place.
Appreciate you. First of all, thank you both for being here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Appreciate you. I am Allie Shaw. I work for 105K Jams, our hip hop and R&B station here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I feel like I get quite a bit from all the people. Hip hop is dead. It's just not the same. My listeners are old school. I play 80s and 90s music on my show. Late 80s, early 90s is kind of my era. Who are some of the artists that you listen to now, that current artists that you feel, do you feel that you have to go dig for the kind of music that you want to hear now? Because I felt that back in our time, it was easily accessible.
It was in your face.
Like your tribes,
The gatekeepers were different.
Right.
Right.
So who are some of the artists that you're listening to now? Both, the question is for both of you, that you are checking for now.
I would say, I'm gonna go back some, because again, I didn't need qualifiers. Like the first time somebody played me Kendrick Lamar's Overly Dedicated, I was like, oh boy, this boy different. He's different. The first time somebody played me Joey Badass for the first time, I was like, oh, he's different. The first time I heard The Internet for the first time, this is past like hip hop, this is all genres. I met Snow Allegra 2 years ago in a studio when she was working on music, and she played me on music. I was like, boy, you sound like every James Bond theme song that has ever been made. She's like, for real? I was like, yeah. You know, and at that time when I meet these artists and I talk to them, I say, it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. So present day now, Griselda was it until now. It's becoming like they're becoming to be everywhere, right? It was Sir from TDE, you know what I mean? And now he's becoming to be everywhere. So it's always a new turn on, you know what I mean? Whether it been a Moonchild, whether it been a Hiatus Coyote, whether it been a, you know, just somebody that's like, man, check this out. And it usually comes from somebody that I respect musically. I don't need the qualifiers. I don't care about the IG page. Play me the song, bro. I want to hear the song. And so for me, that's some of the artists that I've been checking out and still looking. Like I still look for artists to this day, no matter what, just looking for a new sound and a new feel, and wanting to put out more music and until we get to the next one.
I'm gonna go a little bit outside of hip hop for a moment, but Blood Orange,
yep,
is one group for me. James Blake,
yep. And
I first heard James Blake on an HBO series, and I was like, I ain't never heard no shit like this before. And this was before he shows up on Lemonade. In hip hop, this is gonna sound like a weird example. I have two daughters, 21-year-old who listens to what I listen to, and a 17-year-old who does but also doesn't. And when she's driving in the car, whoever is driving gets the music. So I only get to listen to contemporary stuff because of her. And the one person that I keep getting drawn to is this cat Y Melly. Because there's a dissertation about mental health to be written about this cat, right? And as I'm listening to it, I'm like, okay, I understand why my daughter or other 17, 18, and 19-year-olds would gravitate to his music, because he really is talking about what is a generational existential crisis around what the hell is happening in the world, right? And he's actually given language to that in very personal ways.
No problem.
Any more questions?
That's it?
My name is OD. I'm a producer and a DJ up and coming here in Tulsa. For one, I want to thank both of you guys for giving us this educational class. It's very important to me. And another thing, I want to thank you, not Wanda personally, for giving me Duckworth, the sound of that song. Because from the beat change into the lyrics on that song is like a picture so vivid for it.
Right.
And then to tie with that question, do you think we will have more independent, successful labels like a TDE, like a Rockefeller, like a All Money In,
Like a Chandler.
Amen.
I think so. But again, you know, it's getting harder by the day, though, because there's so much what we call noise to cut through to get to, it ties into her question, to get to the point that you don't have to dig so far, right? We live very busy lives now, and people don't, a lot of us come from a generation, like she said, that it was put in the front, the greats were put in the front. They're there for a reason. But now you have to sift and look around to get to what will one day become a TDE, what will one day become, you know what I mean? So I think it is important, but like I said, if we look at like Griselda Records, we have to look at how long it took them to get here. They had a year putting out music at a high rate, like a Master P, like putting out music, because they're too busy trying to get in your face to cut through the noise. Because in this day and time, you can't put out an album, wait 2 years, if you're not on that level. You can do it if you're Kendrick Lamar now, but I'm talking about if you're starting off, you got to put out an album, then you got to come with something else, then you got to come with something else, like, because you have to cut through the noise and stay in people's face. The label that does that is going to be the label that is an independent label that gets to the forefront. But they have to be consistent, though. They can't sit on music at all.
Is everybody standing? I had a two-folded question, basically. No, I'm gonna sit down. I appreciate you for being here too, by the way. There's a lot of real serious artists in Tulsa, you know, serious producers in Tulsa. Sorry, I'm gonna try to speak up, but like I said, it's a two-folded question. But basically, I keep hearing y'all say contemporary music, and I'm in a positive genre, so I know like contemporary, I know the terms and stuff. But like, I would like, okay, so are y'all saying conscious music as the standard, and then everything else is contemporary? You're literally saying like the contemporary.
Like new. We mean new, like new as far as contemporary. I don't, although this like, flip back, I don't get into, it goes back to the skill thing. I don't get into much of if you're trying to say the whales or not, bruh. I've just never been that type of, what I mean by that is, I don't get into the message, I get into the skill of it. Right. I've always been into the skill of it. Like, how vividly can you paint your picture, and can you paint it not sounding like anybody else, right? And so I don't really care, although I do believe what you listen to, you are what you eat. I do believe that, whether it be through your mouth or through your ears. I believe that 100%. But at the same time, I am more wowed by the skill of it. Like, I had a conversation with some of my young boys in my class. So the young boys in my class think, you know, when we say we danced to music in the 90s, they thinking all our lyrics was deep in the party. Like it was deep lyrics in the party. And it's like, no, that's not. And you have to break this down to them. You're dealing with a generation, this is a whole nother conversation, but you're dealing with a generation now that don't dance with each other.
Right.
They don't two-step, what's that? So they don't dance with each other. They got their own, they do it by themselves. So you know what I mean? They stand around. It's a crazy thing. So I'm having this conversation with these two dudes in my class or whatever, these two 20-year-olds. And we're talking about lyrics and all of that. And I'm trying to explain to them the lyrical prowess, but the murder type tone of Mobb Deep, right? So I'm trying to break this down, and they just don't get it. They're like, well, if they spitting lyrics, what do you mean it ain't deep? They just don't, because they think if you're saying something, you're dealing with another, also you're dealing with a generation. If you're telling, it used to be if you're talking about messaging your song, that's deep. Now, if you are just a rapper that have connecting thoughts, that's deep. I put a tweet, before I get back to the homies, I put a tweet up about a year ago. I said to the new generation, is 10 Crack Commandments a conscious song? They said yes. At our time, 10 Crack Commandments wasn't conscious. It was a step-by-step booklet you need to get, right? It was a song, it was a step-by-step booklet how to sell crack, right? They said it was conscious because I have to listen to it and to pay attention. So now the idea of consciousness has changed. So back to the homies, we're talking about Mobb Deep. So I had to say some Prodigy lyrics for them to understand. I'm spit the second verse of Quiet Storm. So we talk about Prodigy. We have a conversation about Prodigy, which if you listen to Prodigy on Mobb Deep's Infamous, he killed about 50 people on the album. You do know this, right? Right. So we're talking about Prodigy, and I'm like, yo, the P-Rock 40-inch cables, drinking white label. My chain hangs down my dick, my piece bang glass tables. They like, whoa. I said, that's what I'm talking about. Like, it sounds great, it's skillful, but he ain't talking about hugging no trees, bruh. So that's kind of what it is like. That's how consciousness has changed over the years, that's a whole nother class.
That definitely is. And then I just quick, because y'all both y'all, I guess, expound on just like a few things you can give, or a few pieces of advice you can give to conscious artists that's on the come up.
What you mean conscious? We just talked about this. What you mean conscious? Huh? Have a message, have a positive message, or just a message? Like, heat always rises. And when I say that is, you can't think just because of the type of music that you have that nobody wants to hear it. I have to tell that to my students a lot too. Man, don't nobody want to hear that. Who are you talking about nobody with you and your 200 Instagram followers? You're not the population of the earth. Like, what are you talking about? You don't know everybody. Like, what? So you have to get out the idea of that nobody wants to hear that. Even if it's Tulsa, Oklahoma, or if it's Stockholm, Sweden. Get your money where you get your money, bruh. You know what I mean? This is a big planet. So somebody wants to hear what you have to say. But the key of that is it has to sound good. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to listen to your music from an objective standpoint. You have to ask yourself, if I played this and I didn't know me, would I think it was good? And a lot of people can't step outside themselves and look at their own music that way. It is tough for them to do it. That's their baby. They get married to it. It's good because I made it. No, it is not. It's not good because you made it. Because you have to not. Another thing is, don't compare I say this all the time. Don't beef and don't make music and don't battle and don't challenge yourself to people that live 10 minutes away from you. What's the point in that? Your challenge is like water for chocolate. Your challenge is Black on Both Sides. Your challenge is The Minstrel Show. Your challenge is Good Kid, Mad City. Your challenge is Illmatic. You are in a battle to not only whatever make somebody music better than people in your neighborhood, you're in a battle with the greatest pieces of art in hip hop history. If you look at it that way, your music will go, because you have to play your music and then you got to play Reflection Eternal and say, it ain't close. We ain't there yet. You have to do that. If you do that, then that's when you'll start to see the change.
Because, you know, you can't be a good writer if you don't read 10 times as much such that you write.
Right.
You know, you got to listen to everything, right? You got to read everything. And, you know, when Knife talks about being honest about your own work, it's also about, do you love it enough to do it if you're never going to have that moment? Right, and because, you know, one of the things that stands out about Ninth and Nipsey is two examples. And John Caramanica was talking about this in the Times after Nipsey died last year. He was talking about what he called the middle-class hip-hop artists.
Yep.
Right, cats who are never going to be at the top of the pop charts, right, who are never going to eat off the culture in the way that a Jay-Z and a Diddy does, but folks who love it enough that they can make a living from it and still live tangentially in the places where they grew up. And there are many more rappers like that, right, than the cats who are on the top of the pop charts.
Would you continue to make hip hop for the rest of your life? I mean, barring inflation and all of that. Would you be a working artist, traveling the world, doing shows, maybe 200-300 people in a room for $120,000 a year? Would you? A lot of people would say, nah, I got to be doing it like Jay, or I got to do it like this, or I got to have this. But what about if you just living in a very comfortable house, rapping for $120,000 a year? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that?
like our man down in D.C.
Right. Who talking about? Asher? Who you talking about?
Came to class. D.C. African dude.
Oh, God. No.
Damn, I can't remember his name.
Yeah, we have so many people come to the class. But would you do that? And that's what it is. Like we get in too much of looking at other people's lanes on Instagram anyway. Right. I'm not doing it like this person. I'm not doing it like that person. Like, it's not about that. If you love the culture and you make pretty good money from it,
right?
What's wrong with that?
Y'all give Dr. Neal and Ninth Wonder a round of applause.